Good morning, everybody. I am sorry that your speaker took ill. It sounds quite fascinating. I was 8 years old, living in and around Detroit when the riots took place in '67. So I'd like to hear your speaker myself. I hope he gets well and can come back. And Cindy, thank you for that. And once again, I can only just apologize for the readings. That's all I can do. So, every time I hear them read out loud when I speak here, I go, what? Okay, all right, good. I'm glad. And Rod was very kind in introducing me, mentioned how incredibly smart I am, but I know you just want me to be funny, so I'll just start with the jokes instead. So, your speaker being ill, it does give me the chance to continue my series of what we owe to one another. If you've been paying attention, you know over the last 3 years, there have been 2 in this series so far. One had to do with social capital, and the other one had to do with empathy. Those of you who were here, feel free to refer to your notes on that. You can take those out. If you're just catching up, I have an abiding interest professionally and politically, personally, on what we owe to one another, how that manifests, etc. So today, and by the way, this morning, they asked the speaker who comes, they said, well, look, there's a small group of people come in the morning, would you just, throw a question out there, and we'll talk about that for an hour or so, and then, you come in, and maybe it has something to do with your talk. That would be nice to kind of prime us. And my question this morning was, so hey, what about that capitalism thing, huh? Which really narrowed it down a lot. And then, so I look at my title today, and it's, technology and talent in the future. And it's like, yeah, that really helps too. Focused right in. Speakers are often admonished, by the way, no matter what the setting, not to speak about innovations in technology, and especially the long-term future, because the field is littered with otherwise really smart, prominent people who have looked ridiculous trying to predict the course of technology and how it'll impact us and our response to it and all that sort of thing. So it's a fool's game to take up technological innovation and the impact on people in the long-term future. That being said, my topic today is technological innovation, impact on people in the long-term future. So bear with me. All right, maybe I can illustrate where I'm going with this with a couple of cases. I was recently in Detroit, speaking of that, and following up on a couple of guys who went through our prison program and how they're faring and what they're doing now and that sort of thing. And we were up in an apartment that happened to look out over a fair bit of Detroit, and we were talking about the sheer numbers of young men, especially, that both these guys were trying to informally counsel in terms of finding their way in life. And one of the dilemmas that came up was, and it's a fairly classic and common one for many of them, which is you got 14, 15, 16-year-old young, oftentimes black men, making a living in the gig economy. They were way ahead of us on this, by selling, running, locating drugs and engaged in other kinds of criminal activity. And one young man had just recently been arrested and put in jail. He was the breadwinner for the house, and the mother's dilemma was, do I take the $3,000 that we managed to save to pay his bail, which happened to be exactly it, so he can get back out and continue to be our source of income, or do I take the $3,000, leave him in jail, and try to build a different kind of life for ourselves? And this isn't 1 or 10 or 100 or 1,000 kids in Detroit or across the country. This is, a much higher number than that. So if you would, as I talk about technology in the future, that's one group of people as I get into the main idea for today, which is universal basic income, a response to poverty on one hand and job displacement on the other. So there's one very large and continually growing group of people who find themselves in an underground economy or marginalized in other ways, not because of too much technology, but usually because of a lack of access to technology, whether that's very basic technology in terms of the tools of learning, infrastructure, the kinds of things, most of us take for granted, or the more advanced technologies that my students are conversant with and are working with. So that's one group as we're thinking. Second group, I do have as kind of a paradigm case, would be my students who are technologically savvy, smart, bright, young people for the most part, who are well positioned to do good things in life, make a bunch of money, etc., who are nonetheless facing, according to a preponderance of scholars, commentators, economists, labor analysis, etc., though certainly not everybody, job displacement because of too much technology, right? That the growth in artificial intelligence and automation threatens not only retail and low service tech kinds of work, but white-collar work as well. There are different, and again, differing takes on this. So Oxford study a couple of years ago that said probably fully 50% of current US jobs could be, not will be, but could be automated by the year 2030. Okay, 50%, we're well into the millions and millions. And the AI and automation that's coming along, while it will also create some jobs, as technological innovations always have, the consensus at the moment, at least from my reading, is that you're still looking at a net loss of probably 10 million jobs, which is equivalent to the Great Recession of 2008. So just even imagine that impact on the economy. So that's the Oxford study. And then the White House Council of Economic Advisors, which used to be a pretty credible group. One is hoping that their bipartisanship and independence continues to make that the case. Recently released a study in which they, again, everybody's best guess looking into the future about where job losses will come due to automation and AI. And if it's a job that pays $20 an hour or less, your chances of being replaced by 2030, and again, this could be, not will be, but could be, 80%. Now, part of that, of course, will depend on us. How freely do we embrace the technologies that would make actual human beings superfluous? And there's some indication that we don't do it to quite the degree that the folks in Silicon Valley and other places think we might, that there are still bank tellers and checkout folks at Meijer drive some of them insane. It's like, what is wrong with all of you that you just can't use the machines? But anyway, under $20 an hour, 80%. $40 an hour and under, you're looking at about 40%. So that gets into some mid-level professional management kinds of positions. $60 an hour and above, the creative class, the knowledge class, the people who are actually at the, in some ways, driving all of this, as well as its greatest beneficiaries. At least as of now, only 4% of those, and in this case, I have to admit, that would be us, are at the threat of being displaced. But here's where, again, the caveats and warnings about making predictions about the long-term future come in. And that is, I know that the technology is there right now, and people have been trying. Find the best philosophy/management professor in the entire world, put his or her lectures online, and what in the world do you need me for, other than the occasional offhand remark, right? So we're all under some threat along those lines. So what I want to talk about primarily today is for those folks who continue to find themselves in the cycle of poverty because of too little technology, and those folks who find themselves faced with the possibility of displacement because of too much. This idea of universal basic income, which has either, depending on your point of view, emerged or re-emerged as a hot topic. It started, at least I started noticing, and I think this is right, just a few years ago, and it came from Silicon Valley itself, in which the Zuckerbergs and Elon Musks of the world, to mention two prominent supporters of universal basic income, looked at what they themselves were creating and said, nobody is going to be able to afford to buy our products. It's the Henry Ford dilemma, right? Unless we continue to provide jobs or basic income of some sort. It's since taken off, and you find it pretty widely in popular and scholarly literature. Again, both as antidote to poverty on one hand, finally, and a response to technology on the other. So it makes for some interesting and strange bedfellows. If you do a history of the idea of universal basic income, which the simplest definition just means the United States government cuts a check once a month to everybody over the age of 18 who is a citizen, which there's that conversation. For right now, the going rate is $1,000 a month. So you're not going to get rich on this scheme, but imagine you're at a job where you're making $1,000, $1,200 a month, and all of a sudden you're making $2,200 a month. For lots of people, you can imagine the huge difference in their lives. It also wouldn't discriminate, though, at least the way it's presented in the main. Everybody, if the billionaires in the room, and you know who you are, you would get your $1,000 a month as well. And part of that's the 14th Amendment, just due process, equal administration. Though there are some proposals, they're called demo grants, and you would look at certain demographics and you would adjust the universal basic income based on people's living situations and income as it is. But what's out there right now is $1,000 a month for everybody over the age of 18 that would be guaranteed by the full faith and confidence of the United States government. All right, the strange bedfellows piece, it's kind of interesting. The earliest proponent, as far as I can tell, of this in the United States of America was that famous, and this idea sounds kind of like anti-American, right? Money for nothing. So that famously anti-American fellow, Thomas Paine, all right, makes the first proposal in which 15 pounds sterling when you turn 18, and then once you hit 55, and back then, of course, not a lot of us made it, but if you did manage to get to 55, 10 pounds sterling for the rest of your life. So early notion of that. It mostly migrates to Europe, and the Europeans, commies and socialists that they are, take up the idea and actually start to implement some of that stuff. It comes back to the United States in the 1960s, most advocated or passionately advocated by two folks you might not imagine normally together, Milton Friedman on one hand and Martin Luther King on the other. And they both write extensively on this idea. For slightly different motivations and intentions. Let's play a game, if you don't mind, and see if you can guess which motivations for introducing universal basic income take a more Kingish feel, and which ones have a more Friedman-esque feel to you. So we want to give people universal basic income because then they can have a life that, because they can meet their very basic needs, a life that is replete with dignity and autonomy, so they can pursue and take responsibility for the choices that they make. Which one's that sound? Okay. What a bright group. We want to give people universal basic income because we want to, as far as possible, dismantle to its very core the welfare state as one conceives of it from FDR through Lyndon Johnson. Did I tip my hand in any way? Is that the problem here? The sneer. In any event, what's potentially has been intriguing, I think, to lots of people, and potentially suggestive that something like this could eventually come to pass, is that it's had support on the right and left for a very long time. King has a terrific quote in which he says, the problem with one of the big problems with the welfare state in America is it's still based on this antiquated notion of scarcity. It's mid-60s. He said scarcity is not really our problem. And we keep developing these programs as if these things weren't there to be given. It's a matter of distribution and political will rather than scarcity. So he's got a not very nice characterization of those of us who are fairly comfortable, who he characterizes as overstuffed at one point, and that there's no particular problem in that. Friedman and Charles Murray and others who have picked up the notion of universal basic income on the more conservative side said, look, the bureaucratic welfare state is unwieldy, it's inefficient, it's replete with fraud, it does not treat people as responsible, and we should dismantle it, give people $1,000, $1,500 bucks, whatever, a month. And you could either say, well, that also makes a lot of sense, and you can see the common cause there. Or in Murray's case, if you know Murray, he's the infamous author of the bell curve. You could read him with less generosity as saying, you know what, all the welfare state has done is made teenage girls get pregnant, and people sell food stamps fraudulent. So let's punish them by just giving them this money outright, and then they'll fall on their face, but they'll have nobody to blame but themselves. So again, the motivations and intentions for this are quite different. The end result is you still get $1,000 a month. In 1969, a presidential commission unanimously recommended universal basic income in the United States of America. It wasn't $1,000 a month at that time. That would be adjusted for the times. It would have been $500 a month or something. President Richard Nixon thought this was an amazingly good idea, sent it up to Congress. The House of Representatives passed it, and the Senate narrowly defeated it both in 1970 and in 1972. We came that close to instituting it in 1972 in this country. I know what you're thinking now, which is, God, I do miss that Richard Nixon. Comparatively, those were the days, weren't they? Jeez, all you have is self-destruction rather than other destruction. All right, what does it cost? Well, we collectively spend about $1 trillion right now on the welfare state, if you add up all the programs together that fall under that umbrella. And regrettably, universal basic income, again, over the age of 18, everybody gets $1,000 a month, unconditionally, would add up to about $2.5 trillion. So one of the stumbling blocks for whether you're conservative or liberal is, all right, who pays for it? How do we pay for it? And when Switzerland voted it down last year, that finally was the reason. It wasn't that they didn't think it was a swell idea. At the end of the day, they could not figure out just yet how to pay for it. So King's response to that would have been immediate and swift, I think, which is, give me a break, that's one submarine, or give me a break, that's one tax loophole for the 1%. Nonetheless, it's going to be a stumbling block, and people like Andy Stern, who was the former head of the SEIU labor union, and others said, look, we really do have to think about that. And we probably have to think about it in terms of and by the way, that $1 trillion to $2.5 trillion does not include Social Security or Medicare. And again, as I'm looking out over the sea of youthful faces, the general consensus among politicians is, you know what, you can touch everything else, but if you even mention Social Security or Medicare, you'll never see Washington, D.C. again, which maybe is not a bad thing. But nonetheless, so it's a combination of tax increases and redistribution, and then the tax that has the most support among the people who are champions for universal basic income right now is a VAT, something that if you traveled in Europe, is just status quo there. You just pay it as you go along, value-added taxes. So that's one of the ways that people are thinking about funding this as we get ahead. Investment bankers, this is again, strange bedfellows. Investment bankers, Silicon Valley execs, nonprofit leaders, et cetera, are coming to the conclusion, are willing to write this and publish it. This is going to be necessary. This is going to be critical. There was a Wall Street Journal piece about 2 weeks ago lambasting all of us who think that the technological displacement on one hand and the cycle of poverty on the other hand aren't that big a deal, that we can retrain people to take the millions of jobs that are coming on the heels of AI and automation. And I discussed that with some of the other folks at Grand Valley, and I said, I take their point, what do you think? And the general consensus was this was wishful thinking on the part of people who are probably employed by robotics lobbyists of one kind or another. So the best thinking, again, with all the caveats about the long-term future, and it's not even all that long-term, is that by 2030, there is a crisis. So this generation of automation and AI is so qualitatively different than anything we've seen before. The capabilities are so astounding. And if you've read anything, I'll just give you one reference. DeepMind is the one that is being worked on in Silicon Valley, in which even the guys who are working on it take a step back and go, oh. And you may have read this, Facebook shut down one of their robotics projects when the computers started inventing a language to speak to one another that no human could understand. And Zuckerberg said, let's just pause on that one for a second. So who knows where this is all going? Why is it fair to do this? Why is it, despite the cost, despite some of the upheaval, it's going to be a mess. You've got just the sheer human cost, the toll of people who otherwise have played by the rules, done everything well, being displaced by automation and AI. And then you've got a chance finally to really do something about the cycles of poverty for that first group that I mentioned. So it does increase autonomy, your own decision making. You can pool resources. Imagine 4 people now totally dependent upon, submissive, subjected to the kind of welfare programs and the bureaucracy that you have to run the gauntlet of to get those services. Instead, ending up with $4,000 a month in a place in Detroit in which they could make their own decisions. Again, left and right, there seems to be some agreement that this would be at least, if not perfect, at least a better system. It puts more money back into the economy as money is more unequally distributed, and that 1% gains more and more. The richest folks, or even the upper middle class, are likely to save the $1,000 a month for one thing or another. The other 98% of us are pretty likely to spend it. That is good. And I think this is probably a little optimistic, but there are some economists who think that the productivity gains of this generation of AI and the subsequent generations of AI and automation could increase the GDP of this country by not just 1, 2, 3%, 10%, 15%. We're going to be awash in productivity gains, which equates to money. We'll see. But it's worth planning for, don't you think? Let's see, what would I do if I was awash in money? And who would I give it to? As to the charge that it's fundamentally anti-American, that's a longer discussion we can leave for the talk 4 in this series of talks that I'm giving. But if you've got Thomas Paine and Martin Luther King and the Richard Nixon administration all on board, how un-American can it be, really? And is it worth thinking about? The other one that you'll hear far more from the right side of the aisle than left, of course, is that it's a disincentive. People will just lie back and drink their Cabernet Sauvignon and not do anything. First, $1,000 a month, you're not going to get rich. Secondly, every place this has been tried, from Dauphin, Manitoba in Canada, to the Alaska Permanent Fund, which is a version of this, to places in Utrecht, in the Netherlands, to places in Namibia. Every single place this has been tried where the social scientists and economists have gotten on board and said, all right, what does happen when you give people money for nothing? Guess what? People stop going to the hospital so much. They stop abusing their wives and children so much. Their health, their own personal health, gets better. People save it for school and entrepreneurial projects. And this was the side note to this, but I guess I didn't really appreciate this until recently. You know who becomes entrepreneurs? And we're so, in this country, we just worship entrepreneurs. It's people from the upper middle class. People who have a family and friends kind of safety network. 80% of entrepreneurs come from fairly comfortable circumstances. One of the arguments that's made for universal basic income is, look, you've got an idea, or we were talking about this earlier, if you're alienated in some way, look, $1,000 a month isn't going to get you a long way, but if you pool that, said, here's a chance for you to do what you really want to do with your life. Take some chances, and guess what? You're not going to end up on the street necessarily if you take those chances. Good for individuals, good for the country, and finally, if it can make some impact on the cycles of poverty that are just as bad now as they were in the 1960s. I know your theme for this month has been peace. I am pretty convinced, anyway, that ending poverty is one of the surest ways to ensure peace. So, with all that said, thanks again for having me out here. We'll see you next time.